It was a cold winter day in 1996 when Princess Diana came to Harrison Machine Works for what was supposed to be a simple courtesy visit. But when Tom Wilson, a skeptical factory worker, challenged everything she thought she knew about connecting with working people, she realized this visit would test her in ways she never expected. The Harrison Machine Works factory in Manchester's industrial district was one of the city's oldest and largest employers. The Victorian-era building, constructed of red brick, blackened by decades of soot and smoke, stood like a monument to Britain's industrial heritage. White steam rose from its towering chimneys into the gray winter sky, while the rhythmic hammering of machinery could be heard for miles around. Tom Wilson had been dreading this day for weeks. The 52-year-old machinist had spent 23 years at the same workstation, watching politicians and dignitaries parade through the factory for photo opportunities before disappearing back to their comfortable lives. When word came that Princess Diana herself would be visiting, his reaction was pure cynicism. "Another bloody royal visit," he muttered to his workmate Alan Hughes during their morning break. "They'll sweep through, pose for pictures, and pretend they understand what it's like to work for a living. Mark my words, she won't last 5 minutes talking to real people." Alan shook his head with amusement. "Come on, Tom. Diana's different from the others. Everyone says she actually cares about ordinary people." "Everyone says a lot of things," Tom replied bitterly. "But when did any of these royals ever solve a real problem for working families? When did Princess Diana ever worry about paying the electric bill or choosing between heating and eating?" The truth was, Tom was carrying a burden that made royal visits feel particularly hollow. Hidden in his overall pocket was his daughter Emma's university acceptance letter, Manchester University Medical School. She had achieved something extraordinary, but the financial reality was crushing. On his factory wages, there was no way to pay for medical school. Emma's dreams would die because of money, and no amount of royal sympathy would change that arithmetic. Tom had spent countless nights at his kitchen table, going over the numbers again and again. Medical school fees, living expenses, textbooks, equipment, it all added up to more than he could earn in 5 years. Emma had worked so hard, studying late into the night while her friends went out, volunteering at the local hospital every weekend, dreaming of becoming a pediatrician since she was 12 years old. The acceptance letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, and Tom still hadn't told Emma the truth about their financial situation. How do you tell your brilliant daughter that her dreams are impossible simply because her father works with his hands instead of sitting behind a desk? As Tom voiced his skepticism to Alan, neither man realized that Princess Diana had arrived early and was standing just around the corner, overhearing every word of their conversation. Her security detail tensed, but Diana held up a hand, listening intently to what these workers really thought about her visit. Frank Robinson, the shift supervisor, hurried through the workshop making final preparations. "Remember what we discussed," he called out to the workers. "Best behavior, clean language, and show some respect when Her Royal Highness arrives." Tom Wilson rolled his eyes. "Respect has to be earned, not demanded," he said loud enough for several workers to hear. "I'll be polite because that's how I was raised, but I won't pretend she understands our lives." His words carried further than he intended, creating a ripple of nervous agreement among some of the older workers who had seen promises broken by politicians and officials countless times before. Betty Parker, one of the few female machinists, whispered to her colleague, "Tom's got a point. My sister works at the hospital where they bring these VIPs through. She says they never remember the staff names, never ask real questions, just smile for the cameras and leave." Michael Foster, a younger worker at the next station, added quietly, "At least Tom's honest about it. Better than pretending this visit will change anything for any of us." Helen Crawford, the factory manager, was coordinating with Commander Richard Vale, head of Diana's security team, when word came that the princess had already arrived and was requesting to begin the tour immediately. There was no time for final briefings or last-minute preparations. "She wants to start on the factory floor," Crawford told Robinson anxiously. "Skip the boardroom presentations and go straight to meeting the workers." "Is everyone ready?" Robinson glanced toward Tom Wilson's section with obvious concern. "Well, mostly everyone." Princess Diana entered the main factory floor wearing a practical navy blue coat and steel-toed safety boots that had clearly been chosen for function rather than fashion. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried herself with purposeful confidence rather than royal formality. But as she looked around the massive workshop, Something in the atmosphere told her this wouldn't be a typical royal visit. The workers had been arranged in a receiving line, but Diana immediately broke protocol by walking directly to the nearest workstation where a young apprentice was operating a lathe. "This looks incredibly precise," she said, genuinely interested in the work. "How long have you been learning this trade?" James Morrison, the 19-year-old apprentice, stammered nervously. "2 years, Your Royal Highness. I'm still learning, but Mr. Thompson says I'm getting better." "What's the most difficult part?" Diana asked, leaning in to examine the metal component he was shaping. "Getting the measurements exactly right," James replied, gaining confidence. "If you're off by even a fraction, the whole piece is rubbish." From across the workshop, Tom Wilson watched this interaction with growing irritation. "Look at that," he said to Alan, straight to the youngest worker, the one most likely to be impressed. "She's playing to the cameras that aren't even rolling yet." But Diana's hearing was sharper than Tom realized. Without looking in his direction, she called out clearly, "I'd like to hear from some of the more experienced workers as well, especially from anyone who might have concerns about this visit." The workshop fell silent. Several workers glanced nervously toward Tom, who had suddenly found himself in the spotlight he hadn't wanted. Helen Crawford stepped forward quickly, trying to manage the situation. "Your Royal Highness, perhaps we should continue with the planned tour." "No," Diana said firmly, walking directly toward Tom's workstation. "I think it's important to hear from workers who have been here long enough to have formed honest opinions about royal visits." Tom felt trapped. He could hardly refuse to speak when directly addressed, but he also wasn't going to pretend enthusiasm he didn't feel. As Diana approached, he continued working on his metal component, not stopping to acknowledge her presence. "You must be very skilled to operate that equipment," Diana said, watching his precise movements. "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" 23 years, Tom replied without looking up. "Same job, same machine, same problems." Diana noticed the deliberate emphasis on problems and the way Tom refused to make eye contact. "What kind of problems?" Tom finally stopped working and looked directly at her. "The kind that royal visits don't solve, Your Royal Highness. The kind that require more than sympathy and photo opportunities." The challenge in Tom's voice was unmistakable. Around the workshop, other workers held their breath, waiting to see how Princess Diana would respond to such direct confrontation. Helen Crawford looked mortified, but Diana's expression remained calm and focused. "Tell me about these problems," Diana said, stepping closer to Tom's workstation. "I'd like to understand what you mean." Tom set down his tools and faced her fully. "With respect, ma'am, you can't understand. You've never had to choose between heating your house and buying groceries. You've never worked somewhere for decades, knowing you'll never earn enough to give your children the opportunities they deserve." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Other workers began gathering around, drawn by the unprecedented directness of the exchange. Diana felt every eye in the workshop watching her response. "You're absolutely right," Diana said quietly. "I've never faced those specific challenges, but that doesn't mean I don't want to understand them better. Will you help me understand?" Tom studied her face, looking for signs of the patronizing sympathy he expected. Instead, he saw what appeared to be genuine interest and, surprisingly, a kind of humility he hadn't anticipated. "My daughter Emma," Tom said after a long pause, "got accepted to medical school, Manchester University. She wants to be a pediatrician, work with sick children. She's brilliant, hardworking, everything you'd want in a doctor." "That's wonderful," Diana began, but Tom cut her off. "No, it's not wonderful. It's heartbreaking, because there's no way I can afford the fees. 23 years of honest work, never missed a day, and I still can't give my daughter the chance she's earned." Diana felt something shift inside her as she heard the pain in Tom's voice. This was exactly what she needed to hear, not prepared speeches or diplomatic pleasantries, but raw honesty about real struggles that affected real families. Before she could respond, Alan Hughes stepped forward to support his friend. "Tom's not the only one," he said. "Half the workers here have bright kids who'll never get the chances they deserve because we don't earn enough." Diana looked around the group of workers that had gathered. She saw nods of agreement, expressions of shared frustration, and the quiet dignity of people who worked hard but struggled to get ahead. This wasn't about individual charity. This was about systematic unfairness. "How many of you have children who could succeed in higher education if money weren't an obstacle?" Diana asked the group. Hands went up around the circle. More workers approached. Drawn by the unusual honesty of the conversation, Diana found herself at the center of a discussion unlike any she had experienced in years of royal duties. Betty Parker, one of the few female workers in the factory, spoke up. My son's got the grades for engineering school, but even with a part-time job, we can't make the numbers work. He'll end up here instead, not because he wants to, but because he has to. Michael Foster, a younger worker, added, I'm taking night classes myself, trying to improve my situation, but it's nearly impossible when you're working full shifts and trying to support a family. Diana listened to story after story, realizing that the individual struggles represented something much larger. These weren't isolated cases of hardship. They were symptoms of a system that trapped talented people in economic circumstances beyond their control. Tom Wilson watched Diana's face carefully as she listened to his colleagues. He had expected her to offer platitudes or make promises that would never be kept. Instead, he saw something that surprised him: anger, not at the workers for challenging her, but at the unfairness of their situations. This is wrong, Diana said finally, her voice carrying a firmness that made everyone listen. Talent and hard work should be rewarded, not frustrated by circumstances of birth or economic background. Easy to say when you're born into privilege, Tom replied, still testing her sincerity. You're absolutely right, Diana said without defensiveness. But having privilege means you have the power to change things, if you're willing to use that power effectively. She paused, looking around at the group of workers who had shared their struggles. What if we could create a system that actually worked for families like yours? Not charity, but genuine opportunity based on merit rather than money? Tom felt his skepticism wavering despite himself. What kind of system? Diana was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through possibilities. A comprehensive education fund, specifically designed for the children of working families. Full scholarships covering not just tuition but living expenses, books, everything needed to succeed. The workers exchanged glances. This sounded like every promise they'd heard before from politicians and officials who disappeared after photo opportunities. With respect, ma'am, Tom said, we've heard promises before. They never amount to anything real. Diana nodded, understanding his skepticism. You're right to doubt promises. But what if this wasn't just a promise? What if we started it today with real money and real commitments? She looked directly at Tom. What if Emma could start medical school this September, with everything paid for? Tom stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. Around him, other workers leaned in closer, their own disbelief mingling with desperate hope. You can't be serious, Tom said. I've never been more serious about anything. Diana replied, but I need your help to make it work properly. I need to understand what real working families actually need, not what bureaucrats think they need. Something profound was happening in that circle of workers. The usual barriers between royalty and working people were dissolving, replaced by honest conversation about real problems and potential solutions. If this is genuine, Tom said slowly, if you really mean to do something substantial, then yes, I'll help you understand what we need. Diana extended her hand to Tom. Partners? Tom looked at her hand for a moment, then shook it firmly. Partners, but I'll hold you accountable for every promise you make. I wouldn't want it any other way, Diana replied. The rest of the factory visit transformed into an impromptu planning session. Diana, Tom, and the other workers sat on equipment crates and workbenches, discussing the practical details of creating an education fund that would actually serve working families effectively. Helen Crawford watched in amazement as her carefully planned royal visit became something entirely different, a genuine collaboration between people who had never expected to work together.
6 months later, the Workers' Education Partnership launched with Diana as patron and Tom Wilson as the first working parent on its board of directors. The program didn't just provide scholarships, it offered mentoring, career guidance, and ongoing support for students from working-class backgrounds. Emma Wilson became the program's first medical student, but she wasn't the last. Within 5 years, hundreds of young people were pursuing careers in medicine, engineering, law, and other professions that had previously been economically impossible for their families. Tom Wilson never fully lost his skepticism about privilege and power, but he learned that sometimes the most important changes come from unexpected partnerships between people willing to challenge each other honestly. Diana discovered that her most meaningful work happened not when she was helping people, but when she was learning from them. The workers at Harrison Machine Works taught her that real change requires more than good intentions. It demands accountability, sustainability, and the wisdom that comes from lived experience. The photograph that hangs in the Workers' Education Partnership office doesn't show a princess graciously helping grateful workers. Instead, it captures a moment of genuine collaboration, Diana and Tom shaking hands as equals, surrounded by people who had found common ground despite their different backgrounds. Sometimes the most important conversations begin with someone brave enough to say, "You don't understand our lives." And sometimes the best response is simply, "You're right. Help me learn."